Now we're going to look at some landforms created via aeolian processes, ones that we find here in Indiana, beginning with sand dunes. And so extreme northwestern part of Indiana, we find the Indiana dunes there on the shores of Lake Michigan. So let's begin with their definition as far as what are sand dunes, and they are wind-sculpted accumulation of sand. Notice sand, not silts and clays. And so the idea here is sand is less capable of being carried far distances, which is something we're going to come back to when we talk about the next type of landform. And so sand is a coarser or larger particle size than silts and clays. So sand dunes, is one of the other characteristics are they originate in areas that lack vegetation. So they're along the shoreline. We're going to see areas that lack vegetation as new sediment is being constantly brought to the beach via waves crashing in and moving that sediment. So that's going to be an area that we see lack of vegetation, so kind of that transition zone from more grassland areas, forested areas, and a shoreline, but also another place where we can find areas that lack vegetation are areas that used to be a lake, areas that used to be the floor or the shoreline of a lake. And that's definitely the case we're going to come across when we look at the Dunes National Park up in the northern part of the state. So where can we find areas that lack vegetation? A river delta, a lake shore, an ocean shore, or an ancient lake bed. So that's the characteristic we find in the northern part of the state of Indiana. Is the extreme northwestern part used to be the bottom of Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan used to be much bigger, but since then Lake Michigan has retreated, and so as it retreats, it then leaves behind the shorelines of an ancient, much bigger lake, which is the case of the Dunes National Park. So another thing we find are, we have this image. I don't know if there's a movie called Spaceballs, which came out in the 80s, and there's a big scene I remember from the movie where they spend the entire time walking across the Sahara, and it's nothing but sand dunes. Well, in the case of the Sahara, yeah, you see a lot of dunes, but very few deserts are actually sand dune covered. Other than the Sahara, there really aren't that many. For the most part, when we think about desert areas, it's a lot like what we would find out in the desert southwest. A lot, patches of vegetation here and there, not just complete areas of sand dunes. And so the idea there is, well, what was the Sahara? The Sahara used to be the bottom of a massive inland sea. Combined with the idea of it being underneath a subtropical high pressure is why we see this area having hardly any vegetation in the Sahara Desert. And so one of the things also when we think about sand dunes is they're key areas. They're areas that are transition zones. And so as more people want to flock to the beaches, as we continue to build up more on our beaches and on our shorelines, what we're doing is removing vegetation, which only encourages landform change, which only encourages aeolian processes and erosion to be at work. And so the idea, we see a lot of new shorelines, these signs say, hey, do not walk on the sand dunes. And so a lot of beaches, what they've done is they've built walkways that go over the sand dunes so people don't walk and come right through that key area, that transition zone, that area that acts as a buffer to prevent further erosion to occur on our shorelines. And so one of the things is dunes, they become larger when vegetation is removed, so don't walk through the sand dunes. Like I said, Indiana dunes we see as far as Indiana landforms. So here we have the predominant wind pattern in this case, and so if you look at the Indiana Dunes National Park, or pretty much where any of the sand dunes that are associated with Lake Michigan are located, they're going to be on the eastern side or the southern side of Lake Michigan. That's largely due to the predominant wind pattern coming from the northwest and heading to the southeast. So we'll see the dunes. We see more dunes on the Michigan side of Lake Michigan than the Wisconsin side of Lake Michigan. And of course, in Indiana, we see this along the southern and eastern shore of Lake Michigan. It's also the northern border of Indiana. And so the idea with this predominant wind pattern, what it does is it helps to sculpt the predictable shape of a sand dune. So here we see the sand dune. Of course, all of this is largely exaggerated for emphasize this for purposes for teaching, but the larger sand dunes, the larger particles of sand can't get carried any further, and so it typically collects, and we see the predictable shape. And so this shape in which it has a flatter slope on one side, in this case the left-hand side of the sand dune, and then on the right-hand side a steeper slope, that illustrates, and that's very much an indicator of the direction of the predominant wind pattern. So that flatter slope is going to be associated with the direction in which that wind is coming from. And so we see a predictable pattern, predictable shape, illustrating the dominant wind pattern. But another thing we see here are the silts and the clays get carried further. So the silts and the clays, which we could call roches, which will be explained here in a future slide, get carried further. And so we can see these silts and clays more collected in areas beyond sand dunes, because the sand dune particles are much bigger. So over here on the left-hand side, this area, this dry lake bed, or an area that's been eroded away by wind, and then we get transportation and deposition occurring. And another way to illustrate kind of the back and forth nature of sand dunes, especially along the beach shores, is this constant back and forth of wind patterns, in which during the day, of course, we've already learned this. During this day, we get the typical onshore breeze. Then at night we get the characteristic offshore breeze, and that helps to kind of cause these sand dunes to be very much, sediment and transport. So when we see, sand at a beach, it's just there temporarily. It's just there for the time being. It's just constantly in transition, moving from one place to the next. And we already know this: the offshore breeze that occurs at night. So going this back and forth, sculpting the sand dunes. And now we know why we see more and more of these signs. And here's an image from the Indiana Dunes, or those who've never been there. This is actually from looking down from the dunes. We can see the vegetation there holding the sand in, but we can also kind of see this shape in which the slope descends down into the shoreline. So we go to our good friend, the Indiana Topography Map. We've already explained, the rivers and all of that. Now we get to showcase the Indiana Dunes, which we find along the southern and eastern shores of Lake Michigan. This illustrates, we'll come back and explain this more when we talk about glaciers, but this just helps illustrate the idea that the Lake Michigan today, that as we see it, is actually smaller in size. And so when the glaciers came through here, scoured the landscape, what they then did is they didn't just go home and turn back the other way and go home. No, they just essentially melted in place. They just melted, and so when they melted in place, of course, they leave behind that massive amount of water. So that fresh water, which filled Lake Michigan, was historically called Lake Chicago way back when it was much bigger. Same with Lake Erie, kind of to the east of Lake Chicago. And more of the same. Retreat. And a little bit more like what we see today.